Welcome to the World of Eora, a news and lore podcast about the Pillars of Eternity games, as well as Obsidian Entertainment's upcoming release, Avowed. Hello everybody, welcome to the World of Eora podcast. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino. Thank you guys so much for joining me on today's episode. I really appreciate this. If you are into the lore for Pillars of Eternity or Avowed, then this is the show for you. For those not in the know, the reason that we pair Pillars of Eternity and Avowed together is because that it shares the same fantasy setting, known as Eora. So as the theory goes, if we dive into the history, lore, and game mechanics for Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, we can glean insights into Avowed as it undergoes development. And in that way, when the game releases, we can all walk forward with an equal base of knowledge about the game world that we're playing in. If you've been following the episodes recently, you'll know that we just wrapped up a 4-part series on the history of the Dyrwood. The Dyrwood is the setting for the first Pillars of Eternity game. Now that we've gone through the entire history up to the point where Pillars of Eternity 1 occurs, we understand the context for what's going on in the game. This episode serves to take a look at the society of the Dyrwood and the people that are there and what makes them who they are as a culture. And now, while the Dyrwood is the setting for Pillars of Eternity 1, there is some precedent that Avowed could take place in the Dyrwood. So, with that all said, let's actually just dive straight into today's lore.
I'm curious. What exactly did you find there?
So, the Dyrwood. What is the Dyrwood? Well, the Dyrwood, as I've mentioned, is the setting for the first Pillars of Eternity game. When you get into that game, you will be playing in the setting of the Dyrwood. The Dyrwood itself is a nation. The full title of it actually is Free Palatinate of Dyrwood, which is kind of a contradiction in terms, because if you're a Palatinate, you're kind of a nation that is subservient to another nation, if I understand the word correctly. So if you're free, like you're independent, you're no longer a Palatinate. But a lot of Dyrwoodans still like to use that title because it reminds them where they came from and what they did to have to get where they are today. If you're wondering what it is that they had to go through, well, you can listen to the 4 episodes that I did before this, where we talk about the history of the Dyrwood. But in short, what occurred is that there was this nation of the Aedir Empire, and they were on a continent far, far away from where the Dyrwood is now, and they went exploring into the world, as nations often do. The Aedirian Empire went across the ocean and found this new continent, and they named this new section of the continent they were exploring the Eastern Reach, and they set up a colony there, and that colony is the Dyrwood colony. You can see the relationship in names there, the Aedir Empire and the Dyrwood colony. The Eastern Reach is also being colonized by other major empires in the game. So the Empire of Rauatai, which is a very naval, military-focused empire, they are also colonizing on the Dyrwood in places and exploring it. Bigger sets of colonies would be the Vailian republics south of the Dyrwood, which is being set up by Old Valia or Grand Valia, depending on what time in the history you're talking. That is another empire who are also entering into this new world and setting up their own colonies. I think there's a lot of parallels, obviously, to the Eastern Reach, or this part of this new continent that's being explored, with North America and the establishment of the USA and Canada. You have these major empires that are already existing in the world, and they go across the ocean, they find this new continent, and each of them are setting up their own colonies and creating their little societies and little sub-countries and dependent nations in these areas. There's clearly a lot of parallels that can be drawn from the discovery and the colonization of the quote-unquote New World, where we discovered North America and we have the nations that we have today. And just like when Europeans came over and discovered North America, there was people that were already living there. And we have a parallel for that in the history of the Dyrwood as well. And so there's actually a 4th major empire that we learn about when these 3 main empires come to the Eastern Reach. We discover that there are people that are already living there, and they call themselves the Glanfathans, and their nation is called Glanfath. So this Dyrwood colony that is set up is pretty much at the border of Glanfath and the Glanfathan nation. And to gloss over a lot of history, there is a lot of tension between these three factions. That is the Aedir Empire, the Dyrwood Colony, and the Glanfathan tribes. The reason being is these Aedirian colonists, the Dyrwoodans, they come to this new world and they started trampling all over these holy sites that the Glanfathans did not appreciate. And in retaliation, the Dyrwoodans were like, well, you're our slaves now. So yeah, there's that. Clearly, this led to a lot of conflict. Just as they're starting to develop peace, however, the Aedir Empire do not like what the Dyrwood is doing, and they start doing things in the Eastern Reach that serve their interests, which are threatening the peace between these two nations. And so the Dyrwood essentially goes to war with its mother nation, the Aedir Empire, and achieves its independence by defeating them, with the help of the Glanfathans, I might add. That is glossing over a lot of history. There is so much that goes on, little tiny things and relationships that are happening and things going on in the background that we don't know about. But that essentially catches us up to where we are today. At this point, once Pillars of Eternity 1 happens, there is a peace between all three of these factions. In fact, the Aedir Empire and the Dyrwood Nation, they are engaged in trade. They have trade agreements with each other. So there's a stable peace that I would say exists at this point. And so that is what the Dyrwood is as an overview. One very interesting thing about the Dyrwood that would make it a great setting for Avowed, and there is no reason that Avowed couldn't be set there. I know the rumors right now are that it's going to be played in Living Lands, but, with any rumor, we take it with a grain of salt. We really don't know. And there is some precedent that Avowed could take place in the Dyrwood. There's no definitive proof. It's mostly just speculative, of course, and you're not going to find a huge post of it on any of the gaming websites. But anyways, if it is played in the Dyrwood, which would be fun, one thing to note is that there is this interesting field of study called animancy, which is not illegal in the Dyrwood. Animancy, in short, is the study of essence. That's capital E essence. Essence is essentially what the soul is made of. So if your body is made up of carbon and whatnot, the soul is made of essence. And the study of animancy is the study of this essence, discovering its properties, how we can quantify it, how we can manipulate it, things that it can or cannot do, etc., etc. So it's a scientific study. The thing is that animancy is outlawed in a lot of places, including the Aedir Empire, where the Dyrwood hails from. But the Dyrwood currently, at least by the start of Pillars of Eternity, we don't know the history past that all the way, the Dyrwood has animancy as legal. So animancy is openly practiced in this area of the world. Now, I say openly, but to be fair, there's a lot of tension there. A lot of people do not like animancy because, you're experimenting with the soul, right? Like, that's not something that a lot of people are going to be okay with. And it's led to some disastrous results, which we discussed in previous episodes. So by the time Pillars of Eternity 1 starts, animancy is still legal, of course. And that makes it a very interesting place to play Avowed. It also might give us a hint as to when or where Avowed might be taking place. If at any point we receive information about Avowed and when or where it might be taking place, if we learn that animancy is completely unregulated in the Dyrwood, then we know that it might be somewhere between when Pillars of Eternity 1 starts and when they colonized the area. So now let's talk about the actual people of the Aedir Nation. Let's talk about the people that are there. So the Dyrwood is made up mostly of Aedir Empire descendants or Glanfathans that have left their peoples to settle in this new society that's being made. The Aedir Empire itself is mostly comprised of humans and elves, particularly meadow folk, which is another way of saying meadow humans. Folk and humans are kind of interchangeable, and wood elves. The Glanfathan tribes are primarily made up of wood elves and Orlans. Orlans are one of the unique races in the world of Eora. They are small, diminutive creatures. They are very hairy and have large ears. And they're quite often looked down upon, no pun intended, because they are short after all. But a lot of people don't even consider them a civilized race, because they live in the forests and they employ guerrilla tactics and they are barely civilized and blah, 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 blah. A whole bunch of the usual stuff that people will throw out there for whatever reason. But they're quite often looked down upon, but very powerful people as well. And great race to choose in making a character for Pillars of Eternity 1 or 2, by the way. and hopefully for Avowed. I'm assuming we're going to have complete character customization for Avowed, but that's just me assuming it. I actually have no idea what character creation will be like for Avowed. So we have humans, elves, and Orlans, and of course dwarves. For those who don't know, the dwarves in this world are very nomadic. They pretty much explore everywhere. So wherever you go, you're probably going to run into a dwarf. You might be an explorer in Eora and go to this new place, and you'll crest over the hill of this ridge below a mountain, and you'll look out at a valley and be like, oh, this is beautiful. No one has ever been here before. I am the first to explore that. And you'll look over to the side, and there'll be a camp with a couple of dwarves just sitting there laughing up a storm because of a joke one or whatever told the other. They go everywhere, these guys. So I don't know why I spent so long talking about the dwarves. But anyways, so humans, elves, dwarves, and Orlans are the main groups of people that you're going to see. And that's because it's a mixture of the Aediran Empire descendants who colonized the area and the Glunfathan tribes that kind of mix together. You'd think that the elves would actually be the highest population since both of these cultures had wood elves, but actually humans, the meadowfolk, are the most dominant race. They're at about 40% of the entire population of the area. The population of the area, by the time Pillars of Eternity 1 comes out, by the way, is like around 2 million, if I remember correctly. So, quite a lot of people. And most of these people actually live in rural areas, so small towns, farming communities, etc., etc. Not a lot of them live in urban environments. I would say less than a quarter, I think, if I remember correctly, are living in urban environments. The main faiths of the Dyrwood, interestingly enough, are 3 gods out of the 11. So there are 11 gods in the pantheon for Eora, and each culture, just like any culture in our world or a fantasy world, there are particular faiths that are more practiced than others or more accepted than others, depending on the values and vices of a particular society. With the Dyrwood, the faiths that are mainly worshipped are the faiths of Galawain, Skane, and Magran. The interesting thing about this is that they actually don't share any faiths in common with their mother nation, the Aedir Empire. The Aedir Empire, I believe, they worship mainly Hylia, Bareth, and Awudica. So they don't even share any of the things from their mother nation in terms of faith, the main ones that are practiced. However, Galawain is a common faith practiced in the Dyrwood as well as Glunfathan. That said, I'm saying these are the main faiths. That doesn't mean other faiths are not practiced. The Aethasian faith is not very popular right now, but I don't really have time to get into why. You'll have to listen to the previous episode. I'm going to shamelessly plug my other episodes, by the way. I'm sorry about that. I can't reference all of them all the time and give full backstory. Any other faith can also be practiced, but these are the main ones that are practiced. Galawain is the god of nature. He's called Lord of the Hunt in all of its forms, I think is his full title. Skane is... I'm kind of concerned to see Skane as one of the main gods that are worshipped in the Dyrwood, because Skane is your token evil god. I will defend him in saying he is not evil for evil's sake, but he definitely is evil. Skane is the god of violent rebellion, secret hatred, and plots for revenge. That kind of god. That's who Skane is. And Magran is the goddess of fire and war. Now, a reason that gods like this might be popular amongst the Dyrwood are partly due to the fact that they have so much conflict for their initial history. They fought with the Glunfathans, and then they fought for their independence. And so praying to a goddess like Magran, fire and war, makes sense. As well, there's a lot of influence from the Glunfathan tribes as the two societies kind of melded and had peace with one another, and they would have learned about Galawain a little more. And so it makes sense that that would stick with. Skane, I don't know how to justify Skane. I'm sure there's a lot of actual good reason for it as well. You know what? Actually, it kind of, thinking about it a little bit, makes sense. The more you dig into the god of Skane, the god of plots of revenge and all that, it kind of makes sense because the Dyrwood were subservient to the Aedir Empire, and then they fought against their superior, quote-unquote, nation to get their independence, which I suppose could be in Skane's purview to pray for, or worship for and whatnot. So those are the main faiths practiced in the Dyrwood. If you want to play a priest character in Pillars of Eternity 1, or you want to play a priest character in Avowed, if we can choose priests, and if we are playing in the Dyrwood, then know that being a priest of Galawain, Skane, or Magran may or may not have certain benefits if you're going to play in this world. and that being a priest of Aethys might not, depending on the timeline of when we're playing this game. If we're playing in the Dyrwood. I gotta clarify that. So those are the main faiths that are practiced. Now, so let's talk about the government of the Dyrwood. The government system of the Dyrwood is different than its mother nation, Aedir Empire. The Aedir Empire is a hereditary monarchy, so you were born into royalty. You are king and queen, they have families, they have kids, the kids grow up and they take over, I believe is how that all works. In the Dyrwood, it is what's referred to as an elective monarchy. And so there is the leader of the Dyrwood, known as the Duke, which is actually a Vailian term, which is another empire, another language that exists out in this world. The Dyrwood adopted this title, I think another way of separating themselves from their original mother nation. So there's the leader of the Dyrwood called the Duke. The Duke is elected by 7 earls. So there are 7 earldoms in the Dyrwood. These are like provinces or states of this nation, and each one of these provinces or states has an earl, a person in charge of the area. These 7 earls that exist vote on who the Duke, the leader of the Dyrwood, will be. You're only having 7 people in the voting population for who is going to be the monarch of this entire nation, but it's still a huge departure from where they came from in terms of a bloodline. You know, it doesn't seem like a big departure. It might just seem like, what, only 7 dudes are in charge of deciding who's going to be in charge of absolutely everything? Like, that's not a lot different. But there's so much fundamentally different with that. You aren't taking the assumption that you have to have like pure blood or something, or you have to be of one particular family in order to lead this entire nation. You're actually taking into account the opinions and values of other people. And these earls, theoretically anyways, should be taking into account what their people want and what's good for their people and what's good for the entire nation. Now, that said, when you leave an entire decision up to just 7 dudes, if one of these people decide that they're not going to vote for a duke for good reasons, they're going to do it for, selfish reasons, things that are good for themselves and might not help their nation, that's 1/7 of the voting population. That doesn't help. So why am I talking about this? This is not a political podcast. I don't know what I'm talking about. But this is a tangent regardless. This is an elective monarchy. Now, I said that there are 7 earldoms in the Dyrwood, but actually there used to be 9, and you don't hear about them a lot in Pillars of Eternity unless you dive into the lore. You'll see the names of some of these earldoms, and so they might be familiar, but they never really come up as a main thing in the game. The 7 earldoms that exist now, these are the names of these earldoms, so you can keep an eye out for them if you play through the first Pillars game. We have Hellsgate, The Grasp, Coldwater, Tenfirths, Norwich, Balereach, and Ashfall. Those are the 7 current earldoms of the Dyrwood. The 2 that were in existence before were Yenwood and Queensrun. However, when the Dyrwood achieved its independence, these last 2 earldoms were viewed as, traitors or what have you. They were on the wrong side of the revolution. And so Yenwood got incorporated into the Grasp, and Queensrun got incorporated into Coldwater. So we went from having 9 to just those 7. Each of these earldoms have their own flag, their own symbols that associate, just like a state or a province. For example, the Coldwater flag has got, all of them are shaped like shields, by the way, like a typical shield where it's flat on the top and the sides kind of curve down to one point at the bottom. The Coldwater symbol is this blue and white checkered pattern with a red falcon overlaid along the entire front of it, and it kind of takes up almost the whole thing. Yeah, so that's the image we have there. At least that's the images I see on the Pillars of Eternity of Wikipedia, which is pillarsofeternity.fandom.com for anyone interested. This is where almost all the lore I'm getting comes from. There are some other sources that come with the PC version of the game, so if you buy the Ultimate Editions on PC, if you look in the game files, there's actually a lot of lore that you can find in the documents there. That's a side note for anyone who's interested. Each of these earldoms have a small history of their own, as well as an earl who is in charge and resources that they ship out. So we could actually spend quite a lot of time on each of these earldoms, but I'm not going to do that right now because we're talking about just the Dyrwood, not the Dyrwood and earldoms. So maybe we'll revisit those in like a bonus episode or something, or once we have to start really diving into some of the like niche lore of this game. And so that is a quick overview of kind of like how this nation is set up. Now, as for the people themselves and what they believe in, like any nation, there are a set of virtues and a set of vices. At least this is how the collector's book puts it. There are things that people generally accept as good and generally accept as bad in every nation, right? And so the Dyrwood is no different. Now, if you go on to the Pillars of Eternity Wikipedia, it will list for you what those virtues and vices are. If you have the collector's book, you can actually go into it and read a little blurb on what they like or don't like about it. Here are the virtues and vices for the Dyrwooden people. First virtue is independence, and I'm going to read the blurb for you for each of these. Independence. Most Dyrwoodens value their independence highly and believe it was earned by the sacrifice of previous generations and are sensitive to perceived infringements upon it. People are expected to be defiant towards anyone who promotes the reduction of personal liberty. I can see independence being a big thing for the Dyrwoodens because they had to fight to achieve independence as their own nation, and so it makes sense that they would value something like that even amongst just the individuals themselves. Perseverance. The colonial settlements went through difficult times, but the perseverance of the original settlers paved the way, sometimes literally, for future generations. People who endure hardship without complaint are highly respected. Again, just the history of their people, persevering is what got them where they are. And so it makes sense that families would pass this value on to their kids because people who had these values are the people who set the path for this nation to exist. Sacrifice. Dyrwood earned its independence through collective voluntary sacrifice. Acts in a similar spirit are respected and admired. Admeth-Hadrit, who was the leader at the time when the Dyrwood was achieving its independence, is considered to be the first and best of all Dyrwoodens, his life and death embodying the virtues of independence, perseverance, and sacrifice. Interestingly enough, there are a few people online who agree that the statue that you see for the Avowed reveal trailer might be depicting Admeth-Hadrit, because as it says right here, for the official lore written by Obsidian, that a lot of Dyrwoodens consider this Admeth-Hadrit guy to be the first and best of all Dyrwoodens. So, who's going to get a statue in this world? Someone like Admeth-Hadrit or one of the deities? And the statue that we see is not one of the deities. Some people think that it is Galawain. I disagree. I could be wrong. Who knows? But it also might be this Admeth-Hadrit guy. So that's something to think about in the future. Communal hospitality. Because of Dyrwood's colonial history and tradition of homesteading, communities are expected to provide a campsite at the edge of town for travelers. The community is also expected to, by default, provide protection for people using the campsite unless those people turn out to be in the wrong, such as one of those that are on the run for their crimes. Travelers who overstay their welcome are encouraged to move on, and if they don't take the hint, are eventually driven out by a mob. Oh man, I never read that paragraph to its end. That's hilarious. So that's really cool. So in Dyrwood, a common practice for any town on the fringe of their town to build a little place where people can seek shelter who are just traveling through or whatnot. That's so cool. That's useful for so many things. I'm sure it's meant to be just for travelers, but I could also see people who maybe fall on hard times taking a temporary shelter there. That's actually a really cool idea. I like that. However, don't stay there too long because eventually an angry mob will run you out of town. You probably can't even come back at that point. The last virtue, so this is something that people consider good, is vigilantism/feuding. So in the early days of Dyrwood, there weren't many authorities to appeal to in times of civic trouble. People learned to handle problems themselves. The side effect of Dyrwood vigilantism was a pernicious trend of long-running feuds. Even though, quote-unquote, official order has come to most Dyrwooden settlements, the cultural mentality towards immediate threat is to respond personally, in brackets, with violence, and never to forget any slight against your family, or in extreme cases, your entire community. So feuding and vigilantism is actually seen as a virtue in the Dyrwood area. So if you have your people, your little community, your tribe, your me and my own kind of thing, having feuds between families or communities or people is seen as normal, and having to seek out vigilante justice for things that are perceived as wrong is also considered normal. In fact, it's even considered good. I can understand why, I suppose, because if you are someone who values justice and you want to see justice be done and you cannot trust the authorities to do it, then that means somebody has to do it. to ignore wrongdoings and let them fall by the wayside is to not value justice. In one way, that's how some people could put it. And so if you are someone who highly values justice, then forming a vigilante mob or group or what have you to deal with those perceived injustices would be seen as a virtue, would be seen as a good thing. The feuding, I'm not really sure what that's about. Maybe that's more about loyalty to your people. And I guess it does also have to do with vigilantism because, you know, you perceive this other group is doing something wrong, so you are trying to stop them, and that is a feud. Now, let's move on to the vices, the things that the Dyrwoodens think are bad. First one, servility. Not a surprise there. Dyrwoodens hate servility, and even hated it when Orlan slavery was widespread. Despite exhibiting the issues of class that exist in any feudal or monarchist culture, Dyrwoods still expect subordinates to show a strong chin, meaning they stand upright when dealing with anyone. Bowing and kneeling are not only frowned upon, but illegal in some communities. Wow, they hate servility so much that to even bow or kneel in certain circumstances is frowned upon or even illegal. So the Dyrwoodens do not like servility, and I mean, that kind of makes sense considering that they fought tooth and nail to achieve their independence from their mother nation. Like, you gotta think about that in the history of any nation. You have a mother nation, you have this nation that sent you there. First off, the very fact that you exist as a nation is owed to that country in the first place by discovering this and setting up a colony. But secondly, they're probably a major source of resources and wealth, and so to cut ties from them in a very highly conflicting manner is to burn a bridge and render another bridge impossible to set up again. Well, I shouldn't say that because they set up trade with their mother nation Aedir, but still, like, that's a big deal. A lot of these people do not like servility, and perhaps people that left the Aedir nation in the first place were people that had these values in the first place. Next is shirking. Among the worst accusations, despite its seemingly mild tone, shirking can apply to any personal responsibility to others or the community. It can also apply to getting others, in other words, law authorities or mercenaries, to help fight your feuds. If someone is known as a shirker, they're largely looked down upon. In extreme cases, entire families can earn reputation as shirkers, especially if they didn't contribute to some large community event, like a battle or putting out a huge fire, etc., etc. So, wow, shirking. There you go. If you have a responsibility to do something, you got to do it. And even if you hire people to do things for you, that's looked down upon as well. Like, you got to deal with this yourself. So it is valued in this community that you be the one to go deal with these problems, not hire somebody else to do it. That's an interesting thing. Selfishness. In the same spirit with which Dyrwoodens view sacrifice as a virtue, they view lack of proactive kindness and charity as selfishness. In some circumstances, this can be expressed as passive-aggressive courtesy, but in most social interactions, it is ingrained, habitual, but genuine politeness. This makes sense. A lot of the things that the Dyrwoodens consider virtuous go against selfishness. The idea of communal hospitality, that is looking out for people who aren't even a part of your town or your community. You might not even know they're there. You might never see them again. They're not going to pay your taxes. They're not going to contribute to your community. And yet a town will set up, maintain, and supply an entire campsite on the outskirts of their town for these wayfarers. Next is lingering. When I read that, the first thing I thought was someone staring at another person lustfully just a little too long. I'm like, yeah, that checks out. But that is not what is meant by the word lingering. This is a non-traditional use of the word lingering. In Dyrwood, it refers to hanging around in or very near Ingwithin ruins. I mentioned earlier that the conflict between the Dyrwoodens and the Arglon-Fathen tribes were that the Dyrwooden colonists were entering into these holy sites, and it was these ancient Ingwithin ruins that the Glonfathens considered sacred and holy. And so that was the source of a lot of conflict, was these colonists kept going around these Ingwithin ruins and essentially trampling on and pilfering and stealing everything that was there. And so that was the source of a lot of conflict. So lingering, it sounds like, means hanging around in or very near those areas. It's considered mortally dangerous and also spiritually dangerous due to the unpredictable appearance of biowax, or spirit winds. If someone is accused of lingering, it is also generally implied that they are mentally unstable or untrustworthy. All right, so Don't hang out near Ingwithan ruins. 1, because you might ruin the peace between you and local Glanfathan tribes. 2, because it's mortally dangerous because of what's called a biowac, which is a special type of wind that literally rips your soul from your body. I did a little mini episode on it a while back. Go check it out. And if you are crazy enough to go hang out in these areas and risk societal unrest and your own soul being ripped from your physical body, people will be like, well, you're clearly insane. And if you're not insane, I don't trust you. So that's kind of the logical implication there. I love that. This last one, the last vice thing that people consider bad in the Dyrwood is, I read this one before I started reading it. So this is quite the vice. It's called face painting. It is when you say that someone has face painted, it is a racist condemnation. If someone is quote unquote face painting, they're acting like or overly sympathizing with Glanfathans. It refers both to the Glanfathan elf practice of using body paint, as well as the multicolor fur patterns of wild Orlans. Not all Dyrwoodans use the term face painting or think that such behavior is bad, but there is a strong streak of racism in many communities, especially near Glanfath. If you are doing this thing called face painting, if you're doing this, that means you're acting like or sympathizing with Glanfathans, which are the local native tribes of the area. So if you're acting like them or sympathizing with them, then you are face painting, and Dyrwoodans in general apparently think that that's bad. There is a negative streak of racism, I would say, in the Dyrwoodan people. So that's something to pay attention to. And I mean, we did bring that up earlier when I said Orlans are considered not even a civilized race by many people. So it sounds like the Dyrwoodan nation has a lot of racial issues that they need to work through. All right, so that is pretty much everything that I have to say about the Dyrwood in terms of its society, its people, how it's set up, a little bit of an overview of how things work on a governmental structure, their virtues, their faiths, their vices. That's kind of that's pretty much everything that we need to talk about with the Dyrwood. Thank you guys for sticking with me through 4 episodes of the history of the Dyrwood, and then through this one episode where we take a look at the Dyrwood as a nation and the peoples and what they believe in. Hopefully after hearing these last 5 episodes, you have a very good understanding of the setting for the first Pillars of Eternity game, as well as Avowed, ? We don't actually know where Avowed's going to be played. I know the rumors, again, are in the Living Lands, but it could be in the Dyrwood. You don't know. I also don't know, so I'm not going to say anything for sure. A couple things that I do want to say, though, about how Avowed could be in the Dyrwood is in the reveal trailer, we have one thing that we see, which is this forest being on fire. It's very early on in the reveal trailer, and that is reminiscent of the War of Black Trees. I've mentioned this before in previous episode. So a lot of people are kind of correlating that scene in the reveal trailer to the War of Black Trees. It might not be. It could just be a generic burning of the forest for the sake of the drama of the reveal trailer. Or it could be a hint towards a piece of historical lore that Pillars of Eternity nerds would know about. As well, the heavy presence of Adiran and Wodokan symbols in the reveal trailer imply a very strong presence of Adiran values or Adiran people. And of course, the Dyrwood was colonized by Adiran explorers. And one last thing is that in the reveal trailer, if you're very, very, very detail-oriented, you'll notice that there are 2 moons that can be seen in the reveal trailer. It's when the arrows... it's when the flaming arrows are flying through the clouds and mist. If you look in the background, you can see 2 moons that are floating around back there. And it looks like their orbits are starting to coincide. The thing is when the 2 moons in Eora have their orbits coincide, there's a natural phenomenon that happens called a lover's tide. And interestingly enough, in the history for the Dyrwood during the War of Defiance, when the Dyrwood achieved their independence, at the War of Defiance, specifically at the Battle of Defiance, a lover's tide occurred. And so we're seeing these 2 moons in the reveal trailer, which indicates a lover's tide is about to or just recently happened. And we're also looking at the fact that in the Dyrwood, there was something of a lover's tide that occurred there that was part of a battle. The only thing that's inconsistent with that, of course, is that if we're looking at these trees being on fire as the War of Black Trees, and we're looking at these 2 moons occurring when a lover's tide occurred at the War of Defiance, those are 2 completely separate historical events, right? So clearly this didn't all happen at the same time. So perhaps the reveal trailer is just going over these different historical events that happened in the Dyrwood. But that again would imply even stronger that Avowed is going to be taking place in the Dyrwood. Now, that's a lot of speculation, and it's not enough for me to even say for sure that this is where I think it's going to be played, but it's enough for me to say it could be, right? And so that's all I'll say to that. So thank you guys for joining me on today's episode. I'm not 100% sure what I'm going to want to do next for an episode, so if anybody listening to this has some suggestions on things that they would like to hear lore about, or things that they would eventually like to be moved into, send me an email at worldofeora@gmail.com. That's WORLDOFEORA@gmail.com. Or send me a message on Twitter at World of Eora. And let me know if there's any lore that you'd like to hear. As well, if you have any comments, questions, criticisms that you want to offer. I love having conversations with people. So yeah, that'd be awesome. Anyways, I'm going to end this episode. Sorry, I'm rambling on. Thank you guys for joining me as we took a final look at the Dyrwood. Thank you so much for joining, and I'll see you guys next time.